Hello everybody. Today we're looking at eliminative materialism, or eliminativism as I'll call it. Well, you've probably realised by now that if you're a materialist, a physicalist, there seems to be a problem with mental states. Where do they come from? How do they work? How do unthinking, unfeeling lumps of matter in your head produce all the wonderful sensations that are going on in there? Well, we've seen some ways in which philosophers have tried to accommodate mental states in the physical, material world, but now we come to a rather different solution. The eliminativist says there is no problem with mental states because mental states just don't exist. Complete eliminativism is the claim that there simply are no mental states. Nobody has ever had a belief, desire, fear, or hope. Nobody has ever contemplated their past or felt a pain or had a dream. Nobody has ever fallen in love or acted in a fit of anger because none of these things really exist. Saying, I believe that grass is green, or I'm so happy, is like saying, I rode here on a unicorn. Unicorns don't exist, and neither do beliefs or happiness. This idea probably seems totally absurd to you, and that's because it is totally absurd, and I'll get to why people accept it in a minute. Firstly, though, I just want to note that there are different degrees of eliminativism. You don't necessarily have to hold that there are no mental states, period. You could instead be an eliminativist about some but not all mental states. Maybe, for example, pains and memories don't exist, but beliefs and desires do exist. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Eliminativism can be partial. Now, the most famous proponent of eliminativism is a philosopher called Paul Churchland, and his wife Patricia Churchland is also pretty famous as far as philosophy goes. But today we're going to focus on Paul Churchland's views. Churchland focuses in particular on a class of mental states known as the propositional attitudes, and they're usually expressed in this way: X phies that P. X phies that P. For example, John believes that his computer has broken. John suspects that the damage is serious. John fears that it will cost a lot of money to repair. They don't have to be expressed this way, the point is that they can be. So, Jackson wants to eat an orange can be expressed in a rather more clunky way as Jackson desires that he himself eats an orange. Any mental state that can be expressed, X phies that P, is a propositional attitude. Beliefs, desires, fears, hopes, thoughts, suspicions, understandings, angers. So this is a very extreme view. A huge chunk of our inner life is going to be thrown out. Significant parts of our language are going to have to change. This is what Paul Churchland holds. Okay, all of those mental states, they don't exist, and they're on the way out. Mature neuroscience is going to get rid of them. Time to address a big question. Why should we hold that whole classes of mental states don't exist? Well, actually, the first question is, how is it even possible to hold that? Mental states, like beliefs and desires, aren't like, say, quarks. If somebody says quarks don't exist, we might not agree with them, but we can at least understand what they're saying. Quarks are theoretical entities posited to explain various kinds of experimental data. I don't posit mental states like beliefs and desires, I just have them. They're the raw data. Saying beliefs and desires don't exist is more like saying trees don't exist. But of course trees exist. There's one right there, I can see it as I look out my window. In fact, mental states are in an even better position than trees, because of course it's possible that I'm hallucinating. We can even imagine that my whole life has been a hallucination, and trees don't really exist and never did. Doesn't seem very likely, but it's possible. But with mental states, I have an immediate infallible access to them. They just happen to me. If I think I'm in pain, then I'm in pain. I can't be wrong about that. Let's call this idea the infallibility thesis. This is the thesis that we cannot be mistaken about our own mental states. John Searle puts it this way. He says that with all this stuff outside your mind, there's a distinction between appearance and reality. So if you're walking in the desert, you might think you can see a lake in the distance, but it turns out to be an illusion. There is no lake, though it appeared that there was one. Now, of course, most of the time, we assume that the appearance accurately matches the reality, but still there's a distinction to be drawn. In principle, even the tree outside might not be real. The ways things seem to you are not necessarily the ways things are. However, this distinction fails when we turn to the mental. For mental states, the appearance is the reality. If it seems to you that you're in pain, then you're in pain. If it seems to you that you believe the sky is blue, then you believe the sky is blue. You can't be wrong about that stuff. So, how could somebody even suggest that mental states don't exist? Mental states, like beliefs and desires, are not things to be eliminated. They are the immediate, raw data that a theory of mind needs to explain. Well, this thesis, the infallibility thesis, this is probably the sort of standard view, and it's therefore difficult to get eliminativism off the ground. But there are three ideas which, taken together, seriously weaken the infallibility thesis. So let's have a look at those. First, it's important to bear in mind the distinction between a conscious state and a description of that conscious state. You are currently experiencing all sorts of conscious states, nobody denies that. But now try to describe one of those conscious states. For example, I might look out my window and this provokes a certain state in me, the belief that grass is green. I have the belief that grass is green. Now I cannot be wrong when I say I'm experiencing some sort of conscious state here. But isn't it at least in principle possible that my description of that state could be wrong? When I describe it as the belief that grass is green, isn't it at least in principle possible that this description gets it wrong? The point I'm making here is that the moment we try to identify our immediate conscious states, our immediate experiences, we go beyond those immediate experiences. We can grant that you can't be wrong about your immediate experiences. In fact, the question of right or wrong doesn't even arise with them. They just are, they just happen. But perhaps you can be wrong about how you describe and classify them. Indeed, this sometimes happens in everyday life, or it seems to. Consider, for example, John says that he loves Sarah, but all of his friends and family say, no, you don't love Sarah, you might think you love her, but you don't. And then shortly afterwards, John himself says, yeah, I was confused. I thought I loved her, but I didn't. Well, in this case, it's not that there was nothing going on in John. We're not saying he had no conscious states at all regarding Sarah. We're just saying that those states weren't what he thought they were. This is a reasonably common occurrence, and it prima facie suggests that we can be wrong about our own mental states. So, bear that in mind. The second point came in the 1950s from a philosopher called Wilfrid Sellars. Sellars argued that our common sense psychology, or folk psychology as it's called, the standard framework of beliefs, desires, pains, dreams and so on, is not given to us by immediate, infallible access. It's not the raw data, but it is as much of a theory as anything else. It's a theory we can use to describe and classify our raw data, among other things. Sellars was concerned with a problem. At the time he was writing, logical behaviourism was quite popular. Now, he rejected behaviourism. He felt that mental states are fundamentally private entities, they're inner states, they're not just behaviour, and we can't directly observe the mental states of others. At the same time, he sympathised with the behaviourist because viewing mental states as private leads to scepticism of other minds. If we can't observe other people's mental states, how do we know they have them? So the problem that concerned Sellars was, how do we hold that other people's mental states are fundamentally private entities while at the same time avoiding scepticism of them? To answer this, Sellars tells a story he calls the myth of Jones. He imagines a prehistoric society of people who are just like us, except they have no mental vocabulary whatsoever. They have no concept of mental states or processes, they can only talk about observable behaviour. Now enter a man called Jones. Jones is struck by a fact that to him is rather odd. People can engage in intelligent behaviour even while silent. Sometimes when people engage in intelligent behaviour, they'll speak about it while they're doing it. I might fix a car and explain in detail to you exactly what I'm doing and why. But very often people will do these things without saying anything. Now, given that this tribe has no mental vocabulary, this would seem very strange indeed. They can only talk about observable behaviour. Now, well, if you see somebody doing something seemingly intelligent and rational, if they're talking about it, they'll be explaining what they're doing and why. So you can observe the reasons that they're giving, and then you observe the intelligent behaviour that results from this. But if they're doing it silently, the intelligent behaviour seems to dangle. It seems to exist without any reason or cause. So Jones wants to explain how this can be. How do we account for silent, intelligent behaviour? And so he comes up with a theory containing a new class of entities. These entities are inner episodes going on inside people's heads, and they have the same kind of structure and function as talking. He calls these things thoughts. Thoughts are basically like the observable declarative sentences that we hear people speak. They have the same kind of role and the same kind of properties. They are related to each other and to behaviour in a roughly law-like way. So one rough kind of law might be people who desire that P and who believe that Q is a means to P and who have no overriding desires will try to bring about Q. And using this idea we can explain silent intelligent behaviour. This behaviour is a product of a kind of inner talking, inner reasoning, which is similar to public language. So Jones explains his theory to the rest of his society, and their ability to explain and predict human behaviour is vastly improved. They can now say things like, he wants the watch and intends to steal it, but he believes that if he tries to steal it during the day he'll get caught. Simple to us, but to them this kind of explanation wouldn't have existed before, and obviously this vastly improves their explanatory resources. Well, now comes an important step. Once people have learned how to use this theory on other people, they then start applying it to themselves. They have ideas like this: I have just done X, so I must have been thinking Y. Over time, the theory becomes more and more entrenched and internalised, and children are brought up with it and just learn it naturally. People become very skilled at reporting that they're thinking and what they're thinking. Eventually, they no longer have to infer what they're thinking, they just know it immediately and spontaneously. Consider an analogy. I look at an object and say, that's a red plant. Now there's no inference involved here. I don't need to think about it at all, I just see that it's a red plant, immediately and spontaneously. But this wasn't always the case. At one point I had to learn the words red and plant, and I had to learn what they applied to. And at this early stage, it wouldn't have been so obvious whether something was a red plant. I might have had to engage in some sort of reasoning. But as you grow up, you become an increasingly competent language user, and eventually judgments about common public objects, like that's a red plant, require no thought at all. For another example, just try learning something new, like carpentry. It would take me a great deal of time to identify a piece of wood by its texture or by how it looks, but a skilled carpenter would know the wood immediately and spontaneously. It wouldn't require any reasoning. The people of Jones's society are in the same position with regard to explaining their own behaviour and describing and classifying their own internal states. First they ascribe mental states to others, then to themselves, and once they become sufficiently competent at using the theory, their judgments of their own states become immediate, spontaneous and non-inferential. They just see immediately that they have a belief or a desire or a pain or whatever. What's the moral here? According to Sellers, our folk psychology is just like Jones's theory. It has the same kind of status, it serves the same kind of roles, it's even learnt in the same kind of way. Because language, of course, is learnt in a public context, and that includes language for inner states. So words like anger, belief, desire, love, wish, and so on are initially learnt, like every other word, in a public context. You have to learn how they apply to other people and so on. You can't just learn how they apply to yourself, because language is public. So, folk psychology is a theory. It postulates various entities, mental states, and mental states are related to each other and to observable behaviour in roughly law-like ways. We use this theory to predict the behaviour of others and to describe and classify our own internal states. Recall the problem that Sellers wanted to address. How can we hold that other people's mental states are private, so in principle we can't observe them, without falling into skepticism? Well, it's simple. Consider that we can't directly observe quarks, but we believe in them because the theory that postulates them is so successful. The same is true of mental states. Folk psychology postulates various kinds of mental states. Folk psychology is very good at explaining and predicting behaviour, so we have reason to believe that other people have mental states. Sellers wasn't an eliminativist, but this notion of folk psychology as a theory is essential to eliminativism, because theories can be falsified. They can, at least in principle, be shown to be wrong. If the entities of folk psychology are just the raw data, as the infallibility thesis holds, then eliminativism is incoherent. But if folk psychology is a theory, then it becomes at least in principle possible that it might be wrong. Incidentally, this idea that folk psychology is a theory is known in the philosophical literature as the theory. So if you ever see anyone talk about the theory, that refers to the idea that folk psychology is a theory. Okay, finally, an idea from philosophy of science, made famous by Norwood Russell Hanson, the theory-ladenness of observation. So looking at what we've said so far, you might be willing to accept, okay, folk psychology is theoretical, but it remains the case that when I make observations of my own mind, these observations show that folk psychology is true. Folk psychology is an entirely accurate description of what's going on in there. For example, it postulates beliefs, and when I look in my own mind, yep, there are some beliefs. Unfortunately, things aren't quite so simple. You see, this sort of response is probably based on the sort of standard view. Standardly, people draw a strict distinction between theory and observation. So they think it works like this. You have a theory, you deduce some predictions from that theory, because the theory will make various claims about the world, so you can make predictions from it. And then you do an experiment, you look at the world, you make observations. If the observations conflict with the prediction, the theory is false. If they confirm it, we have reason to believe the theory might be true. Observation is a neutral arbiter of theories. Now, on this view of the relationship between theory and observation, folk psychology is clearly shown to be true by our observations of our own minds. When I observe my own mind, when I introspect, I see beliefs, I see pains, I see desires, hopes, fears, and this clearly vindicates folk psychology. The trouble is that this is a very naive view of how theory and observation are related. The view these days is that observations are not neutral. Observations can be biased by the theories we hold, and indeed making any kind of observation at all requires some theoretical background. There's no such thing as an observation made independently of a theory. People with different theories will make different observations even given the same data. So theory evaluation is much more complicated than simply checking if your observations match what the theory says. Maybe this is a bit obscure, but to really kind of bring out this problem, here's an excellent illustration of theory-ladenness from Churchland himself. He imagines a society of people just like our society, normal humans who speak English, with one difference. Where we speak of things being hot, warm, cold, and so on, they speak in terms of caloric. Caloric theory is a real, though now defunct, theory of heat, which holds that heat is a special kind of fluid called caloric that flows from hotter bodies to colder bodies. All bodies hold caloric in something like the way that a sponge can hold water. Caloric will flow from one body to another if you put them together, and if the caloric pressure in one exceeds the caloric pressure in another, just like heat, which flows from hotter to colder bodies. So these people accept caloric. For them, it's just common sense. Whereas we say X is hot or X is cold, they say X has high caloric pressure or X has low caloric pressure. Now, caloric is not true. I mean, we now know that heat is a matter of kinetic energy of molecules, but these people accept caloric. But what's more, they don't just accept it, they claim to perceive caloric pretty much directly. For example, they can see it. When caloric is at high pressure, it becomes a red colour, then orange, then yellow, then white as the pressure increases further. So they can directly, they see it when things get hot enough, as we would say, or when things get at a high caloric pressure, as they say. Further, they can directly feel it. If they put their hand on a body with high caloric pressure, they will have the distinctive sensation of caloric fluid flowing into their hand. And if they put their hand on a body with low caloric pressure, they'll have the sensation of it flowing out of their hand. They can feel this stuff directly, and they can see it, so they directly perceive it. So in one sense, these people experience the same things as us. They're part of the same world, and they have the same perceptual apparatus. But in another sense, their experiences are very different to ours. We might say they experience the same things in different ways. The observations that they make when they study temperature are different to the ones we make. And this is because they approach the world with a very different theoretical background. They approach it with the background of caloric theory. They may not even be aware that it is a theory. To them, caloric is common sense. I mean, look, you can directly see it and feel it in just the same way that I go outside and directly see a tree. There doesn't seem to be any theory involved there, but there is. All the observations that we make are dependent on theory. It might be a very deep and well-entrenched theory, but it's theory all the same. And according to the eliminativist, this is also the case for introspection, for observations of our own minds. If you agree with Wilfred Sellers that folk psychology is a theory, then it follows, given the theory-ladenness of observation, that folk psychology will infect the observations we make of our own minds. When we introspect, when we attend to our inner lives, we do it via the theory of folk psychology. Let me spell all this out again, because it's important. I've mentioned that there's a distinction between a conscious state and a description of that conscious state. Now, when I introspect, when I think about my own mind, I will describe and classify all the stuff that's going on. I'll say that is a belief, that is an anger, that is a pain, and so on. But to do this classifying, I'm using the theoretical structure of folk psychology. And because folk psychology is so well entrenched, it doesn't seem like I'm using a theory. It seems to come naturally, directly and immediately. In exactly the same way that observations of caloric come naturally, directly and immediately to the people in the imaginary caloric society. If you go and tell them that caloric doesn't exist, they'll think you're just crazy. So with the three ideas that we've seen in place, what we have is that folk psychology is an empirical theory. The entities of folk psychology are not immediately experienced, but are theoretical entities that we use to describe and classify immediate experience. And like all theories, folk psychology is in principle falsifiable, its entities in principle eliminable. At this point you should be able to see what we've done here is attack the infallibility thesis that as far as the mind is concerned, appearance is reality. We've attacked the notion that people have infallible, immediate knowledge of their own mental states. If you insist that you just directly see that you have a belief, or that you're in pain, or whatever, your argument is no better than somebody from the caloric society insisting that they can just see caloric. An observation is only as good as the background theory that supports it. Our picture of our own minds can, at least in principle, be falsified. So the next step for the eliminativist is to argue that it will be falsified. Right. Okay then, so folk psychology will be falsified. That's the next step. Churchland gives a number of reasons to suppose that folk psychology is on the way out. He thinks it has some very severe deficiencies. First, there are major explanatory inadequacies. There are a huge number of things that it fails to explain. The first point here is that its scope is far too limited. As a theory of cognition, it should apply to all the creatures that actually engage in cognition. But really, it applies only to normal language-using humans. This is one place where Churchland takes particular exception to the propositional attitudes. Propositional attitudes, as we saw, are mental states that can be expressed x phi that p, where p is a proposition. Essentially, the trouble is that propositions are linguistic entities, and non-human animals, and even many humans, do not have any grasp of language and hence cannot literally have propositional attitudes. A baby cannot literally have beliefs. Take a baby called Frank. We might say that Frank believes the milk is in the fridge because he's seen the milk come out the fridge many times, and whenever he gets hungry, he tries to move to the fridge. But the belief that the milk is in the fridge consists of the concepts the milk, the fridge, and the relational concept inness, and it requires having these concepts related in a certain kind of special way. The milk is in the fridge and the fridge is in the milk are different beliefs because of their different arrangements. Propositional attitudes, then, are like sentences in the head. Intelligent behaviour arises from manipulating these sentences. For example, somebody might say they want to open the fridge because they believe the milk is in the fridge and they desire to get some milk. Learning is a matter of accumulating more sentences and relating them to each other in the right way. Okay, for normal language using humans, this is no problem, but for babies and animals, propositional attitudes can surely only be attributed metaphorically. They can't have sentences in their head because they don't have sentences, period. We simply cannot account for the cognition, the rationality, the intelligence, or the learning of babies and animals by appealing to propositional attitudes. So here is a serious deficit. Turning to language using humans, folk psychology is impotent with regard to mental illness. Attempts have been made to account for mental illness in terms of folk psychology. For example, Freud's psychoanalysis, where I think you have sort of unconscious beliefs and desires, and that tries to explain mental illness in that way. But none of these attempts have been all that successful. I mean, there are big problems, whether you sort of accept psychoanalysis or whatever or not. I think we can all recognise that they haven't been all that successful. They haven't really been perfect. Similar points are true for brain damage. It's very difficult to account for what goes on here in terms of folk psychology. And even for normal humans, folk psychology is very poor. There are a huge number of things that remain complete mysteries on this framework. Belief acquisition, learning, rationality and deliberation, visual illusions, creative imagination, intelligence differences, our ability to control and direct our own behaviour, what exactly the function of sleep is, how memory works and how we're capable of lightning-fast retrieval of memories, and so on. Most of what's going on in our heads isn't really elucidated by folk psychology. So these seem like pretty severe problems. But in response to this, I just want to note something that Churchland himself says in his famous article, Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes, which I'll link to below. Failures on such a large scale do not yet show that folk psychology is a false theory. Of course not. So what do they show? They show decisively that folk psychology is at best a highly superficial theory, a partial and unpenetrating gloss on a deeper and more complex reality. Now, the trouble is that I think pretty much everybody agrees with this statement. Churchland's argument demonstrates pretty conclusively that folk psychology is severely deficient in various ways, that its scope is limited, that it doesn't tell us much about what actually goes on inside the brain. But there's nothing surprising about this. It seems to me that this doesn't really tell us anything we didn't already know. Of course folk psychology is limited. That's why we need scientific psychology and cognitive science and neurobiology and so on to try to get at the deeper realities it misses. But this in itself doesn't in any way suggest that folk psychology is radically false. It only suggests that it's incomplete and superficial, which we all already knew anyway. I mean, an important question you have to ask yourself is, folk psychology, okay, it doesn't elucidate memory or visual illusions or belief acquisition or whatever, but is that the point? Is that what folk psychology is supposed to do? We'll actually have a look at the functions of folk psychology in the next video, but it's important to see that Churchland here takes folk psychology as a theory of cognition, as a theory of what's going on in the brain. But it's very questionable whether folk psychology is really supposed to be about that. It does involve what's going on in the brain to some extent, but its actual functions might be slightly different. Folk psychology isn't neuroscience. Nobody denies that. So I don't think that Churchland's argument here is quite as powerful as it may seem. Okay, let's have a look at some of his other arguments. Second, the past history of folk psychology. It has demonstrated retreat and stagnation. So with regard to retreat, in our distant past, and still in some small-scale societies, folk psychology was used to explain all manner of phenomena. Tribal peoples attributed mental states or source spirits in all kinds of natural phenomena. They posited the world as being run by various gods, and the fortunes and misfortunes of the tribe could be explained by appealing to the actions of the gods. Natural disasters, disease, crop failures, droughts, supernatural agents are responsible for all of these. Natural objects have spirits, and so on. Obviously, the domain of folk psychology has become increasingly restricted until these days we apply it only to some of the more complex animals. So folk psychology has retreated very significantly. Once it was applied to all kinds of things in the world, now its domain is very restricted. Not only has it retreated, it's stagnated. Folk psychology hasn't developed in any significant way for at least thousands of years. You can find basically the same theory in the ancient Greeks as what we use today. So not only does folk psychology have serious problems, as we saw, there hasn't been any advance in solving these problems. It hasn't evolved, its resources have not developed, and its range of application is increasingly limited. So we have retreat, increasingly limited range of application, and stagnation. The theory hasn't changed or evolved at all. Again, I don't think this argument really works. Somebody who defends folk psychology can easily explain retreat. There are many reasons why folk psychology might have been overextended and applied to things it's not appropriate to. There are all sorts of stories we can tell here, but here's one story. We have a natural drive to understand things because understanding helps us organise our own lives, and just for its own sake, the pursuit of knowledge is good. So people in the past wanted to explain the world. But we also have a tendency to give explanations in terms that we're familiar with. Humans spend most of their time with other humans. Folk psychology explains human behaviour, so when confronted with events in the natural world, people appealed to folk psychology because it was familiar and because it's an easy explanation. Obviously, once science improves, we develop different explanations. This is a perfectly plausible explanation of why folk psychology has retreated, but it doesn't suggest that folk psychology is wrong for humans. What about the stagnation of folk psychology, that it hasn't evolved at all? Well, if you believe that folk psychology is largely correct, this is completely natural. It's not stagnating, it's just got it pretty much right, so there's been no need for it to change. So this is a questionable argument, I think, this one. Okay, third, folk psychology is incompatible with the rest of our worldview. Physics, chemistry, evolutionary theory, biology, neuroscience, all of these fields are providing us with an increasingly integrated and very powerful picture of our development. Folk psychology is currently no part of that picture, and there are no signs that it will be integrated anytime soon. What's more, many contemporary sciences have developed the resources to explain various things about human cognition and behaviour on their own terms, without any appeal to folk psychology. So just take contemporary neuroscience and you'll see that it explains many things using a completely different framework. The mature theory of heat had no place for caloric fluid, and it looks like the mature picture of humans will have no place for folk psychology. Folk psychology is simply not vindicated by science. To quote Churchland, its intentional categories stand magnificently alone. Now maybe I'm misunderstanding Churchland here, but this argument looks to me straightforwardly false. In fact, folk psychology is perfectly well integrated with the picture of the world that's emerging from contemporary research. Just take a look at psychology, sociology, anthropology, criminology, human geography, sexology, history, political theory, moral theory, and so on. Many sciences and humanities, which are developing perfectly well and making good contributions to our knowledge, make use of folk psychology. Now, granted, you don't find it so much in the hard sciences, in physics and chemistry, but why on earth would you expect to? I mean, I don't see the relevance of that point. What's relevant is that the general picture of the world, as it's being developed by the best research traditions, and folk psychology is deeply integrated with this general picture. Perhaps what Churchland is really suggesting here, and this is a line he has taken before, is that there appears to be no place in folk psychology, no place for folk psychology in mature neuroscience. So the argument here might go like this: since cognition happens in the brain, and since neuroscience is the science of the brain, then if neuroscience doesn't vindicate folk psychology, we would have reason to suppose that it's false. Again, Churchland's focus here is on the propositional attitudes, mental states that have sentence-like structures, beliefs, desires, wishes, hopes, fears, etc. And he argues that neuroscience shows that the brain simply doesn't encode information in this sentence-like way, so it doesn't appear that we're going to find propositional attitudes in the brain. How does the brain encode information? Well, Churchland draws an analogy to television screens. Television screens don't have propositional attitudes or any other sentence-like structures. Rather, they have hundreds and thousands of pixels, and they encode information as patterns of activation across the population of pixels. That's basically how the images on a television screen are produced, patterns of activation across a population of pixels. Pretty much the same thing goes on in the brain. Patterns of activation across populations of neurons. Except in the brain, there are many different, somewhat independent populations of neurons, rather than just one population, as on a TV screen. So, for example, when you look at something, there's a particular activation pattern over the millions of neurons in your retina. This information is then sent down the axonal fibers and results in an activation pattern in the neurons at the visual cortex. This activation pattern at the visual cortex can then, by way of synaptic connections in the brain, cause an activation pattern in a third population of neurons, which itself, by way of synaptic connections, can cause an activation pattern in a fourth population, and so on. Eventually, we might have an activation pattern in the motor neurons, which direct the muscles to move. This is how the brain actually works. This is how the brain gets things done. Well, this is obviously a very simplified picture, but this is a sort of very basic outline. Cognition, even very complex cognition involving reasoning and argument and so on, should be explained not by appealing to sentence-like propositional attitudes, but instead in terms of the structure of the synaptic connections between different populations of neurons. What allows a person to move quickly to dodge a ball, or to engage in public speech, or to write a 1,000-page philosophy tome, is the structure of his synaptic connections. So when we look in the brain, we don't find any propositional attitudes. What's really going on in there is very different indeed. And given that the brain is the only plausible place for our mental states to occur, at least if you're a materialist, well, since the propositional attitudes don't seem to exist in the brain, it looks like they don't exist, period. I think this is probably the best argument Churchland has, but I still don't find it very persuasive. Recall the view of the machine functionalists, that the mind is a computer program. Whether you agree with them or not, I think there's a helpful analogy with computers to be drawn here. Computer programs clearly exist. I'm using a couple of them to record this video. Now, if you were to look at the hardware of a computer, if you were to look at the bits of circuitry, the chips and transistors and so on, you wouldn't find anything like the computer programs I'm currently using. Certainly you wouldn't really be able to understand a computer program by looking at the computer hardware. The hardware can shed some light, but if you want to understand a computer program, you need to go to a higher level of analysis. And I think the same can be said for the propositional attitudes. Okay, so we don't find them when we look at the neurobiological structures in the brain. But so what? Why would we expect to find them there? That's the wrong level of analysis for them. Finally then, a general inductive argument. Folk theories in general have a very poor record. Consider, for example, folk cosmologies, which try to explain the nature of the heavenly bodies. Many of these were completely wrong. For a long time, a kind of cosmology developed by Aristotle was widely accepted, which had the Earth as a fixed centre, and revolving around it were 55 crystal spheres. Or folk theories of the fundamental constituents of matter, again derived from Aristotle, was the idea that there are four basic elements: fire, earth, water and air. Related to this was the humourist theory of medicine. The body contains four distinct humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile and phlegm, and all illnesses are caused by an excess or deficiency of one or more of the humours. Folk explanations of mental illness often appeared to witches or demonic possession. These examples can be multiplied endlessly, and many of these folk theories survived for thousands of years before they were discredited. We now know that they were simply wrong. They've just been wholly eliminated. The starry spheres simply don't exist. Witches simply don't exist. It's not just folk theories that have suffered elimination. The same happened to many plausible scientific theories, as we've already seen with the example of caloric. So when we look at folk theories and even proto-scientific theories, we find countless examples of elimination. And given this history, it's utterly implausible to suppose that our folk theory of the mind, by some amazing stroke of luck, happened to get it right, especially since consciousness is vastly more complex than just about anything else. How could we have got that right first time? So to state the argument simply then, most folk theories and proto-scientific theories of the past have been eliminated. By induction, the prospects for folk psychology are not good. There are two big problems with this argument. First, many past theories have not been wholly eliminated, but partially reduced, so the inductive argument is fairly weak even on its own terms. Many of the things that we take to exist today were taken to exist by societies past, like trees and clouds and lightning and so on. But there's an even deeper problem here. You see, Churchland relies on drawing an analogy. He says, look, folk psychology, being a folk or proto-scientific theory, is like the theory of witches or Aristotelian cosmology, and the modern eliminativist is like the radical pioneer who rejects these theories wholesale. The trouble is that there are actually many different analogies we might draw here, and it's impossible to know at this juncture just which of these analogies is the correct one. Churchland suggests that the eliminativist is like the radical astronomer who denies the existence of the Aristotelian crystal spheres. But what if the eliminativist is more like the astronomer who denies the existence of stars, or the existence of points of light in the sky? Similarly, with regard to caloric, is the eliminativist like the radical chemist who denies the existence of caloric, or is he like the rather insane chemist who denies the existence of heat? The trouble is that we can't know which analogy is the right one until the debate is over, until we have the benefit of hindsight and we can say whether or not eliminativism has been successful. Now, if modern eliminativists are like the people who denied the existence of crystal spheres or caloric, well, sure, eliminativism is reasonable and plausible, but if they're more analogous to the people who denied the existence of stars or the existence of points of light in the sky or heat, then eliminativism is just nuts. So the point here is that the kind of inductive argument that Churchland uses to defend eliminativism can easily be flipped into an inductive argument against eliminativism. Just take each case of past elimination of a folk theory and then compare the modern eliminativist to somebody who denied the existence of something that survived the elimination. Yes, Aristotelian cosmology was eliminated, but the modern eliminativist is like the person who denied the existence of stars. Now you have an inductive argument against eliminativism just as good as the inductive argument for it, and this suggests that induction doesn't really say anything either way. We can't appeal to induction here. To appeal to induction, we'd need to know which analogy is the right one to draw, but we won't know that until we know whether or not eliminativism was successful. Anyway, those are Churchland's arguments. I don't find any of them persuasive. I think they're all quite weak. There might be better arguments against folk psychology out there, but Churchland has always been basically the primary exponent of outright eliminativism, along with his wife. So to sum everything up, Churchland's basic case is quite simple. What we have are three premises. 1. Folk psychology is a theory, not fundamentally different from any other theory of things in the world. And this is supported by the 3 points we saw against the infallibility thesis. 2. Theories are falsifiable. We didn't look at this in any detail because pretty much everyone agrees on this, but I suppose if you want to disagree with the eliminativist, you might try to drive the wedge in here. And 3, there is good reason to suppose that folk psychology will be falsified. This is supported by its explanatory inadequacies, its past history of retreat and stagnation, its incompatibility with the scientific worldview, and induction on past folk theories. In my opinion, all fairly poor arguments. Okay, we've covered a lot of material today, so I'm going to wrap it up here. We'll look at objections to eliminativism in the next video. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.